Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. We're now into the New Testament, and I want to talk a little bit about what it means to read the New Testament missionally. As you're doing your primary reading through the scriptures, I want you to keep a few things in mind. Again, at this point in the narrative now, we've talked about Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection. And I want to go back to the diagram that I started drawing from the beginning of the semester, and now we've reached to the point where we have Jesus the Messiah. And again, the Old Testament's been leading up to this point. So we had creation, we had the fall, we had God's calling of Israel as that new hope, as God's answer to the problem of human sin and a broken creation. God called Israel, beginning with Abraham and Sarah, to be this missional community that was going to reflect God's character to the world, for the world, and in the world. And we also talked about how Genesis 1 to 11, with the creation and fall, that was the whole world in view internationally. And then at Genesis 12, the Bible trims down to focus on a particular people called for a particular purpose. That's the nation of Israel, God's people. Well, that reaches its climax again in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And not just any Jesus, but Jesus the Messiah. In other words, the long-expected ruler who was going to renew David's kingdom and who was going to announce the kingdom and the restoration of things. The kingdom, the long-awaited era of God's salvation, has now come to pass and is initiated, inaugurated in Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection. Now, post-resurrection, a couple of things happen that are significant. We talked a little bit about this in the previous videos. Number one thing is the ethos of God's people shifts from the Old Testament, where it was essentially come and see. In other words, the kingdom, as it was being reconstituted in the Old Testament, was focused on a place, on Palestine, on the promised land, on the land of Canaan. Now, post-resurrection, Jesus sends the church out to make disciples. And we saw that in Matthew 28, beginning of Acts, the end of Luke. There's a movement out, a movement away from the center, away from Jerusalem, outward, including, as we mentioned, the Great Commission takes place not in Jerusalem, but in Matthew 28, it's back up in Galilee. So it's out to those borderland marginal areas, and the gospel is going to be carried across the known world at the time by persons that we're familiar with, such as the Apostle Paul, who becomes the disciple to the Gentiles. Again, Paul himself began with Jews, so if you go to Romans chapter 1, to the Jew first, then to the Gentile, but the gospel moves out, and so when we start thinking about the biblical narrative as a whole, we want to draw the rest of the story kind of like we began, with an international focus. So when we get to the New Testament, the focus shifts away from just one people to now focus on the new people of God, the church. And the era of the church, the mission of God's people, isn't to wait around to see if people will come or come to Jerusalem, but the gospel is carried outward. It's go make disciples of all nations, so the nations return. Now, a critical feature of this new time and the empowering part of the church is the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on God's people, beginning in Acts 2 at Pentecost. At some level, this puts us in a similar position to the last time we had an international focus. Do you remember the last thing that happens, the last story that we found in the Bible in Genesis 11? And I'm not talking about the genealogies in the chapter, but remember the beginning of chapter 11. What do we have? The Tower of Babel, where God spreads out humanity that once again is going over its limits, and God sends out across the globe people. And so the world is filled with persons who speak different languages. People in God's image are everywhere, but people aren't living in God's image because they're lost. Well, in this time, at Pentecost, what happens? The people are brought back together, and the church is empowered dramatically and powerfully to be able to communicate the gospel, not just in one language, but in all the languages. There's a key principle here that we're going to see throughout the New Testament, and that's going to be the principle of incarnation. We can also call this the missional piece. It's the idea that the gospel can be translated into any language and in any culture. President Tennant here at the seminary likes to say that Christianity is the only major world religion where its book, the New Testament, is written in a language different than the founder of the religion, Jesus. And scholars debate whether Jesus could have spoken any Greek, but primarily as a Jew in the first century, Jesus would have spoken Aramaic. So it's interesting that the New Testament's not written in Aramaic, his language, but actually in Greek, which was the language of the empire. So the gospel is translatable into any language and culture, which is critical for us. So as we read the New Testament, we want to remember that mission is central. So often, and when I grew up in church, grew up in Sunday school, I always read the New Testament for information about doctrine. Now, don't get me wrong, the New Testament gives us the basis for biblical theology, for systematic theology, for understanding who Jesus is, those sorts of things. But what's important to understand is the New Testament is written to distinct communities that are spread out around the Greco-Roman world. For example, Paul's letters are written to the Christians, to the small house churches that were existing in the different cities. So Galatia was written to a certain part of Turkey. Romans written to the Christians in Rome. Philippians written to the Christians in Philippi, and so on and so forth. And what Paul's doing is Paul is writing to them letters, not to give them the whole story, because presumably Paul taught them when he was there. But Paul was writing to them for specific reasons to help them to become the people that God needed them to be in that city in order to reach that region with the gospel. So underneath the New Testament isn't just a doctrinal interest. That's certainly there, because Paul wants to correct things. John wants to correct things. The different New Testament writings are correcting misunderstandings. But the goal of correction isn't just to get right doctrine. It's to get right doctrine so that the church can win the region with the gospel. So there's a missional undercurrent. Again, why do we have the Bible as a whole anyway? It's not just to get information. There's a missional reason that we have the Bible. It's that God is making himself known. And so Paul writes these letters. And one of the things when we read the New Testament is we want to ask ourselves, how does this book, whatever you're reading, form disciples who can make disciples? That's a different kind of question than maybe you've ever asked when you've read the New Testament. But what's the missional reason for this? So we want to focus on that. So that's going to be a key thing. As you read the rest of the New Testament over the last weeks of this course, ask yourself, how do these texts shape and form disciples for mission? Again, the Spirit is a dominant force here. So how does the Holy Spirit function in these books? How do we see that go mentality? How do these books shape us for discipleship? Now, a couple of things. Paul's letters are written over time, and as you do more research in biblical studies, what you're going to find is that the letters get separated out. Oftentimes, some scholars speculate that Paul didn't write all the letters that have his name on it. Personally, I think there's really good arguments for that. The entire group of Paul's letters were written by Paul, but what you'll sometimes see is people just focus on what they call the seven undisputed letters of Paul. And when you hear that phrase, I just want you to know those are the letters of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. These are the letters that scholars don't debate about that Paul wrote. Now, what does that then leave out? The letters of Ephesians, Colossians, Second Thessalonians, and then the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy and Titus. But these are what's known as the authentic letters of Paul, and you'll see that language sometimes used of Paul. But regardless, this is the Pauline corpus. Then what's the rest of the New Testament made up of? Again, notice Paul wrote a huge chunk of the New Testament. Now, what that leaves then are what's known as the general epistles, which we have the book of Hebrews, we have James, we have 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st to 3rd John, forget about Jude, and then we have the last book, the book of Revelation, which is its own genre. Now, when you look at general epistles, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John and Revelation also get included and linked to who? To John. So the major writers in the New Testament, we have Luke, who wrote Luke and Acts. We have Paul, who wrote a large block of letters, 13 letters that bear his name. And then we have first and 3 epistles, the book of Revelation, and the Gospel of John that gets associated with the Apostle John. So those are major writers that we're dealing with in the New Testament. But in all of these, each of these authors have distinctives as they were inspired by the Spirit to write these. But all of these letters are written to form disciples who can make disciples. So you want to be thinking about that as you read that. And think about, we've talked about missional hermeneutics consistently. How do these texts shape us for mission? What kind of person are these texts attempting to form so that the disciples who are reading these passages and these texts so they can go out and win their city? What's the lessons there? What are the missional techniques that we see? When we read the book of Acts, we saw that the gospel was presented in different ways. Sometimes the apostles preached using the Old Testament heavily. Sometimes, like Paul at the Areopagus, preached using parts that were present in the culture, like the altar to an unnamed God. When you read Paul's letters, sometimes he uses lots of Old Testament quotations, sometimes he even quotes Greek poets. So notice how they work to translate the gospel into language that the people at the time could understand. Now, in the last couple minutes, let me deal with one other issue that you're confronted with when you read the New Testament. And that's the issue of what makes up the church. We're talking about the international focus. So what that means is when the church is expanding, one of the challenges of the first century church was the makeup. You have a combination church of Jews and Gentiles. And remember that within that Gentile group, that's everybody other than Jews. So that's every other ethnic group, every other nationality other than Jewish persons. So there's an extreme amount of diversity within the Gentile group. And another piece that shows up here is the issue of slavery in the New Testament. And as you read that, remember that within these groups, Paul's also talking to people from different social classes. And it isn't just slave or free, but that's what shows up in the New Testament. And remember this, 1 out of every 3 persons in the New Testament times was a slave. Think about that. So you put 3 people in a row, one of them's a slave. And slavery wasn't based on your ethnic background. Slavery was based on, you could be on the wrong end of a war, you could have been sold because of debt, you could have been kidnapped. There were lots of different reasons why you could be a slave. And also slaves were allowed to be educated. So you could find slaves who were professors. Like I could have been a slave in the ancient world. Depending on what your trade is, you could have been a slave, all the way down to the most menial kind of tasks. So there were lots of different kinds of slaves. The last couple minutes, let's look at this Jew-Gentile piece. This is the big shift. Because, again, the scriptures up till this time, everybody had been a Jew, which means they practiced things like circumcision. They ate certain kinds of food. They only hung around with certain kinds of people. And so as the gospel goes out into the Gentile world, the majority world, the burning question in the New Testament is this. Does a Gentile have to become a Jew before they can hear the gospel and become a Christian. That's why there's so much talk in the scriptures about things like circumcision. Why is it such a big deal? It's a initiation rite into a community. But it's this: do I need to become a Jew to become a Christian? Now, the New Testament says authoritatively, no. But that's burning in between the lines and underneath the New Testament, that question of identity. And let me just suggest this for us today in your own church. Think about this. What does a person have to become to hear the gospel in your context? What do we do? What do we assume the person already knows, or what do we expect them to be before they can hear the gospel from us? That's essentially what was going on here. Jewish Christians, understandably, are thinking, geez, they have to become Jews. They have to become circumcised. They have to practice certain kind of food practices. Now, another thing that you read a lot about in the New Testament that's related to this, the gospel's now into the Gentile world, so guess what? All meat that you would eat in the empire was dedicated to some god already. And so the question is, can you eat meat sacrificed to an idol? And we're all thinking, that's crazy. But you couldn't, where did you buy meat in the ancient world? You bought it in temples. And these temples were all to these gods other than Yahweh. So a burning question in the early church was, can we eat meat that we know was sacrificed to some other god? And so these are missional kinds of questions. So I'm going to stop this video at this point, but as you think through these things, I want you to read the New Testament carefully, thinking about it missionally. Why are the apostles writing these things? They're writing these things to shape their audience for mission. And so when we read them today, they serve not simply to give us doctrine, not simply to give us models of how they did things in the past, but to help us missionally to use our imaginations to figure out how can we articulate the gospel in the most profound and clear and cogent way in the 21st century. I'm Brian Russell. Thank you for listening.